Hello and welcome to the second of a 4-part series of videos here on the WEX channel for Canon. My name is Raj K, and this week I'm going to be taking you through macro photography. Macro photography can seem quite daunting when you first start looking into it. With extension tubes, magnification ratios, and focusing rails, it all seems a bit much. But actually, it can be quite a simple area to get into. A couple of things that are worth mentioning right from the start. We will be using interchangeable lens cameras for this. And it's worth noting that simply putting the camera into scene selection mode and selecting the macro setting isn't going to give you a proper macro image just because you put that in that setting. You will still need a dedicated macro lens to give you a true macro image. I'll get on to what makes up a true macro lens a little bit later. The last video, if you didn't see it, was all about the Canon range, covering quite a few of the Canon bodies as well as a lot of the lenses. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the M6 Mark II, which was in the last video, as well as the EOS RP. The RP is Canon's entry-level, full-frame mirrorless camera. It strikes a really nice balance between image quality, price, as well as keeping the size and weight incredibly small. You can think of it as a mirrorless equivalent of the 6D Mark II. It shares the same 26 megapixel sensor, but it does have a few more features that give it a little bit more of an edge compared to the 6D. Particularly because it's smaller and lighter, but it also has 4K video and some features that will help with macro photography, which we'll talk about a bit later. We have a bit of a selection of macro lenses within the Canon range as well. For the EFS range, we have a 60mm macro and we have a 35mm macro. For the EFM range, we have a 28mm macro. The 28mm and the 35mm macro both share a unique feature in that they have a built-in ring light on the front. The ring light can be toggled on and dimmed, and also you can toggle just the one side or the other if you want a little bit more of a directional light. So if you're just getting into macro photography, this would be a brilliant option. As they're small and light, the image quality is superb, and you wouldn't need to buy yourself a ring light. For the EF mount, we have two 100mm macros. We have a non-L and an L version. So L is Canon's red ring versions. It gives you better image quality, better build quality, and in this case gives you image stabilization, which the non-L does not have, which will be particularly useful for macro photography, especially if you're doing it handheld. The other one we have is a 180mm macro lens. This is a little bit older and a bit more specialist, so you don't often see it, and for most people the 100mm is pretty much bang on. The last one we have is the 65mm MPE. This is a very specialist lens that does not have a focus ring. You simply set the magnification and move the camera lens closer and further away from the subject until it's in focus. I won't be covering this lens in this video as it's so specialist. So a macro lens gives you a 1:1 ratio image on your sensor. So what does that even mean? When you're talking about magnification ratios, you're talking about the size of the image projected onto the sensor from the lens. So if you have a 10mm size subject, on a 1:1 ratio, it is projected onto the sensor at 10mm. If it's a 1:2 ratio, then it's projected onto the sensor at 5mm, making it half the size, which means you're not going to get that same level of image quality and that same size representation on the sensor. If you have a lens like the MPE, which is able to do 5 times magnification, you can increase the magnification onto the sensor. So the size of the subject becomes much larger and you're able to really focus in on the minute details more than your eye would be able to see. It's also worth mentioning that just because a lens is capable of a 1:1 magnification ratio, it doesn't mean that it's always doing a 1:1 ratio. A 1:1 ratio is only achieved at that lens's minimum focusing distance. So the minimum focusing distance is how close you can be to the subject to focus. In the case of the 100mm lens, it's 30 centimeters. So at 30 centimeters to the subject, I'm getting a 1:1 ratio. But it's also worth mentioning that 30 centimeters isn't from the front end of the lens to the subject. It's actually from the sensor to the subject, as minimum focusing distances are always measured from the sensor, which is why you have a little line on the top of the camera to indicate where in the body the sensor is. One of the main considerations within macro photography, and the most challenging part, is depth of field and controlling depth of field. We talked about depth of field quite a lot in the last video, but I am going to be covering it quite a lot in this video too, because it's basically all about control of depth of field. And depth of field, or sometimes known as depth of focus, is the amount of the image that is in focus. So if you imagine with a very shallow depth of field, I might have my eye in focus, but my nose will be out of focus and my ear will be out of focus. That's a very shallow depth of field. If we had a very large depth of field, everything from my hand here all the way to the background would be in focus. Now we can control that with various different ways. The most common and well-known way is to use your aperture. So a small aperture gives you a large depth of field, and a big aperture, an f1.2, gives you a very shallow depth of field. Within macro photography, it's compounded a little bit because we're using longer lenses, so 100mm is a bit of a longer lens, and long lenses give you a shallower depth of field. The other part of it is we are focusing on things that are very close to the camera and the lens. And as I demonstrated in the last video, your distance to the subject makes a big difference for the amount of depth of field that you get. If subjects are further away, much more depth of field is able to be had in an image. The way to get around this within macro photography is to use your aperture, so you use a small aperture, but by doing that, you're massively reducing the amount of light you can get in the image. So then you have to push up the ISO or use a slower shutter speed, and that can be problematic for various different reasons. You might not be able to hand hold a slow shutter speed, or your subject might be moving, and you might not have enough light even with high ISOs, and you're going to get a very grainy image. So there are multiple ways of getting around that problem. We can either introduce extra lighting sources, so we can have a flash, and a common one for macro photography is to use a ring flash, which is why it's so great that two of our lenses have ring lights built into them. It allows you to get that sort of shadowless light effect on your subject without any extra parts or accessories. With flash, most commonly people would have one of these, a speed light. And part of the issue with that is you can't tilt it down enough to get to the subject because it's so close. And often, if you're using the lens hood particularly, you can get the shadow of the lens on the subject, and it creates a bit of a problem in itself. So there are methods of bouncing that light down onto the subject. There are ways you can do this with DIY options, as well as things you can purchase to create that light. You could also mount your flash guns on the around the lens, so you have flash guns side by side on your lens. There's so many ways of doing this. Another way is to just buy a ring light or a macro twin light, both of which Canon do, which puts the light around the outside of the lens. By doing that, you get a shadowless effect because the light is sort of coming from the outside of the lens. I won't be using flash for this video, which makes a change for me, but I'm going to try and use nearly all natural lights, apart from the ring light that's built into these lenses. I'm not a particularly big fan of ring lights and putting flashes around the lens, as I find that the light is so narrow and directional from the same point of angle as you. It's a little bit like having a head torch on, and it doesn't look all that nice to me unless there's other light sources involved as well, and that's just providing a bit of fill-in light. The other methods of getting around depth of field with macro photography are using some techniques, one of which I'll go into a bit later, which is a modernized version of the old-fashioned way of using macro rails. Macro rails is still used quite a lot, but if you're photographing things quite quickly or things that might move, using the newer version of this technique, the focus bracketing, allows you a little bit more flexibility and is a little bit cheaper as well, because you won't need to buy dedicated macro rails. What macro rails used to do was you would set your focus and you'd have the camera on a set of rails, and you'd move the camera slightly further forward and slightly further forward and slightly further forward, and every time take a picture. And then you'd build up a collection of images which you then combine in Photoshop or image editing software afterwards to give you an image that is in focus throughout the subject. This isn't all that practical because you need quite a bit of equipment to take with you, and your subject would need to be very stationary. It's quite a time-consuming way of doing it. There are other ways that are much quicker, both handheld and using a tripod, that I'll show you a little bit later in the video. A lot of people get into macro photography primarily to photograph flowers, and in my garden the last flowers around are these roses, so I've come out to photograph those. Like every other area of photography, macro photography is very much dependent on your composition and the lighting around your subject. In this garden I've got quite a lot of stuff in the background, like the shed, some fencing. There's not a lot of attractive backgrounds to have. So it can be a little bit difficult to get a clean and sort of non-distracting shot. When it comes to lighting, I've picked a time of day where the sun isn't directly on the flowers to avoid getting really harsh shadows. But if you are photographing in the middle of the day, what you can do is use the inside of a 5-in-1 reflector where it's just a diffusion panel, and hold that up above the plant. That way you're going to get a really nice soft light and it diffuses the sunlight. The reflector is an incredibly useful tool for so many areas of photography, including macro photography. I can use it not only to diffuse the light like that, but also I can use it to bounce some light back into the subject if there is quite a strong directional light. But I can also use it to separate out the subject from the background. So I've got my reflector here, but it also has a black side, and I can use that to create some separation between the subject and the background, and isolate the subject, create more of a minimalist type of image. For these images, I'm not needing to go to the minimum focusing distance, so depth of field isn't so hard to get the entire flower in focus. I'm shooting at f5.6 for this to get the entire flower head in focus. If it's a windy day, like today, and the flowers are blowing around a lot in the wind, you can find it easier to put the camera into servo mode. So I've got it on a single point autofocus in servo, so it's continually tracking the flower as it moves in the wind. I've also actually got it in burst, so I can fire away a little bit quicker to ensure that at least one of my shots is going to come out in focus. I've got a little bit of flexibility anyway because I've got a bigger depth of field by using a smaller aperture. But because things are moving around, I do need to keep my shutter speed slightly higher as well, so it's at least 250th of a second. The last thing you can do when photographing flowers is to add some texture into the flowers as well by spraying a little bit of water. So I've got some water spray here, and I'm just going to spray it all over the flower head to make it look a little bit like morning dew. Another really simple subject for macro photography is eyes. I'm using Jade's eyes here because my own are so dark that they don't actually appear very well in images even with a ring light. I've actually had a professional ring light macro photography guy who does images specifically of eyeballs and then prints them onto little drinks coasters, and they were so dark he couldn't put the flash bright enough to get anything out of my eyes because they're so dark without actually blinding me. In this clip I'm using the 28mm macro lens for the EFM on the M6, and you can see without the ring light the image is very dark because I'm having to use a relatively small aperture because there's actually quite a lot of depth in a person's eye. So you can see without the ring light I'm having to use a very high ISO, and the image is quite grainy. It's also quite dull. With the ring light I'm getting a much cleaner, sharper image. You can see the reflection of the ring light in the eye, but I think that looks quite nice anyway for me, so I'm happy to leave that in. Okay, so I got up early in the morning to come and photograph these insects because in the morning they're not very active. Being cold-blooded animals, they need to warm up and they get more active later in the day. And I thought that I would be able to photograph them with the morning dew on them and that sort of thing. However, I'm not finding a lot because I don't know the area very well, and I don't really look for insects very often. However, I have found quite a lot of spiders, so I'll photograph those. So I'll photograph them the best I can and show you how I go about that. So just found this little dude. It's very cool. I think he's got some breakfast there. Shooting with the 100mm macro L lens, and I'll focus on the spider, then lock the focus. In terms of camera settings, there's two ways I can go about this. I can go for quite a small aperture and try and get as much depth of field as possible, because when you're photographing macro stuff, the depth of field is very, very shallow. The other way of doing it is to use a big aperture, so I'm shooting at 2.8, and particularly as it's low light here, that might be necessary. So I take multiple pictures focusing on slightly different parts of the spider and go further back as I go along, and then stacking that in Photoshop when I get back. A lot of people think you need a tripod and a rig to do that, but it's not really necessary. If you've got some steady hands, you can stick the camera in burst mode, lock the focus on the first image, and then just roll yourself forward as you take images. That way you're getting slightly different increments of focus in every single image, and then you can combine them afterwards. So I'm going to give that a go with this spider that has got some breakfast already, and see what I can get. The spider's in is a very cool web. It sort of comes around it. I'm going to try and photograph that because that's very cool. I've decided to come out to Salsey Forest, which isn't too far from my house, to try and photograph some fungi. Because the first instinct often with macro work is to photograph flowers. And at this time of year, there isn't a great deal of flowers to look at. So I've come out to the woods to photograph mushrooms, but there's also a lot of textures in the mosses, and there's berries out to see. There's loads to photograph if you just stop and have a look. While I'm out here, I'll be using the 100mm L macro on an adapter on the RP. As I've said in so many of the other videos, there's absolutely no disadvantage to using your existing EF lenses on the R system. The adapters and the lenses and the cameras work absolutely perfectly together. In fact, you'll actually see advantages from doing so. I'm using the RP because A, it's incredibly lightweight. I don't really want to carry a lot of gear while I'm out here, but also it has the focus bracketing feature inbuilt into the camera. So what that does is it allows me to set the camera up on a tripod and photograph a subject at different focus distances. So it automatically runs through a focus distance from here, then here, then here, then here, then here, then here, and it runs through hundreds of shots if you like. That way you can combine all of those images and get a perfectly in focus image in Photoshop afterwards. It is possible to do this technique handheld, but it is a lot easier if your subject is stationary to set up a tripod, run through with this technique. That way there's absolutely no sort of movement in between the images, and they line up really nicely when you run them through the Photoshop system. Because we're going to be doing the focus stacking technique, I need to keep the camera as steady as possible, but I don't have the steady enough hand, so I've brought my trusty Manfrotto tripod. This is a 190X Pro, it's a bit of an old version, but any tripod would do, and that's going to hold the camera completely steady so that when we bring the photos into Photoshop, they are all lined up and they all match. In terms of camera settings, what I won't be using is the automatic macro mode in the scene selection inbuilt in this camera. The RP and similar cameras have a scene selection. You go in there and it has a mode dedicated to macro, and it will do an okay job, but because these subjects are stationary and I want consistent results, and I know, there's opportunity to experiment myself, I'm going to put it in fully manual, and I'll set the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO to get the results that I want. In this video, I am using dedicated macro lenses. Macro lenses give you a much better chance of getting closer to your subjects than any other type of lens. With some zoom lenses, it will say macro on the lens, but it's not giving you a true macro. It's simply referring to the minimum focusing distance. It's a bit of a marketing term. Well, you can do that with other lenses if you use extension tubes. Extension tubes are just simply spacers that sit between your camera and the lens, and they move the lens a bit further away. This increases the magnification of that lens, but it does mean that you can't focus on things that are far away. so you can only focus on things that are really close. With a macro lens, you can do both. You can focus on really close and really far away. There's a lot of choice in focal length with dedicated macro lenses as well. And it sort of depends on the subjects that you're going to be photographing as to which one you should go for. If you're photographing things that are going to move around quite quickly, you want slightly further away working distance, because they're all going to give you a similar image at their minimum focusing distance, because they're all giving a 1:1 ratio. So if I'm photographing on an RP, I have the choice of photographing on 100mm or potentially 180mm macro. With 180mm, I'm just getting the same image, but I can be further back. So if I'm photographing butterflies or insects that are going to move quite quickly and be disturbed by me being close, I'd want a sort of bigger distance between me and the subject. So that larger working distance enables me to get a better image.
No, I mean, the fact that you're sitting in the children's play area, wouldn't that be funny? You don't want to mention that.
No, I'm not going to mention that I'm a children's player, innit? So that was a lovely day of mushroom hunting. Unfortunately, I didn't find anything edible, so I'm going hungry tonight, but we got some lovely images. I've come out on a day like today because the light's beautiful, the sun's coming through the trees and it catches the subjects, really makes them pop. And particularly when you're looking for subjects, it's worth looking for subjects with the lovely colour palettes. So that purple mushroom against the green moss, catching the sun and slight moisture on it, glinting, it always looks so much more beautiful than just a mushroom in some mud. Mushroom in mud can look beautiful too, but just look for some colour palettes and interesting textures around your subjects as well. And with that empty-handed disappointment, back to the studio. Now that I'm back in the studio, all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching. I'm not going to be doing the editing part of these images in this video, as we're doing an entire video dedicated to post-production slightly nearer Christmas. The exact date can be found on the WEX website. The next video you'll see from Canon here on the WEX channel as part of this series will be on the 4th of December, and that'll be on landscape photography. That one won't be with me, it'll be with a much more talented landscape photographer, and I'll be back with you slightly nearer Christmas for the final part, covering post-production, where I'll be taking an image from each of the videos and walking you through the whole process of post-production. As always, I will leave you with a slideshow of images so that you have time to ask me anything you like in the live chat. And if you're watching this back, you can always send me a message on Instagram. I'm on there on @rajk.photo. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.